Good morning, guys. This is Ben Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here with another section of our Benny's Bats for today, Sunday, August 9th. We have a full 15-game schedule on the slate today, so there's a lot of games, and I want to get right into it. The idea of the Benny's Bats section is we look at all the pitchers that are on the mound today and try to figure out which, what their weakness is, and then which batter's profile to do the best against them. We go through it pitcher by pitcher. We figure out, are they, better to right-handed or left-handed batters? And then we figure out which batters on the other team, are the ones in the best spot to have a good game today. The first guy I want to talk about today is Johan Flande from Colorado. He has allowed right-handed bats to hit 269 against them. But last year in 2014, he allowed right-handers to hit 296. He is a left-handed pitcher, so I think you can look at a lot of those right-handed bats on the Washington Nationals. The one guy who stands out is actually their big left-handed bat based on the numbers, and that's Bryce Harper. Harper has a 445 WOBA with a 275 ISO number, so whether it's a lefty-on-lefty matchup or not, he's still the best hitter they have on that team. They do have a lot of those right-handed bats that are healthy now, guys like Jason Worth, guys like Zimmerman, guys like Rondon. They've all come back off of the DL, so I think all those guys are guys that could be in play. Next guy we can talk about is Jerome Williams. Jerome Williams has allowed left-handed bats to hit 324 against him this year and right-handed bats to hit 339 with 15 home runs and 59 innings pitched. Now, I don't really like this San Diego lineup all that much, but the one guy who does stand out and is very good in righty-on-righty matchups is Justin Upton. Upton has a 362 WOBA with a 215 ISO score, and he's already hit double-digit home runs in righty-on-righty matchups so far this year. So I think he's another guy that we can look at and try to get into some of our rosters. Let's see. We got Brad Hand going up for Miami. Right-handed bats have hit 290 against this left-hander with a 141 whip. He hasn't allowed a home run this year, though, so I don't expect a lot of upside plays coming out of this game. But, he usually does allow any of the home runs that he allowed usually do go to right-handers in years past. Let's see. I guess you can look at – there's not much in that Atlanta team that you really like. Maybe Johnny Gomes, probably one of the better bets, 355, 125, 355 WOBA, 125 ISO. But, I mean, that's how bad it is. There's really nobody on Atlanta that stands out as somebody that you want to attack Hand with. And, again, that game's in a pretty good pitcher's park, too, so I wouldn't be looking to go too heavy. If I had one guy from that game, that would probably be more than enough. Let's see. We got Chris Bassitt going up for the Oakland A's. Left-handed bats did better against him in 2014. He's actually been a little bit tougher on him this year, but that is the way you probably want to go and try to attack him. Against right-handed pitching, that means you got a guy like Preston Tucker, who's probably tops on the list for this Astros team. He has a 383 WOBA with a 262 ISO score. He has been a little bit cold lately, and he is a little bit banged up, so just be careful using him. But, strictly based on the numbers, he's the one guy that really stands out in a lefty-righty matchup for that Houston team. You could also look at a guy like Hank Conger, 493 WOBA, 383 ISO score. I know he doesn't have a ton of at-bats yet, but those are some really big numbers. He's been hitting the ball well. They've been putting him in the meat of that order. So I think he's another guy that you can look at here today. And obviously, Carlos Correa against any handedness of pitcher is somebody that you got to consider. Shortstop's a weak position. It's tough to fill. Correa, even in righty-on-righty matchups, has a 370 WOBA with a 255 ISO score. So he's somebody that, whether it's a right-hander or a left-hander, you have to consider. I don't think he's a great option today, but again, he's always somebody who's in play, always somebody you have to look at if you have the money to spend up for him. Let's see. Next guy we can talk about is Danny Duffy. Right-handed bats have done better against him, 266 with 10 home runs. This game is at Kauffman Stadium, and there's nobody on that Chicago White Sox team against left-handers who has over a 340 WOBA or over a 170 ISO. So there's really nobody at all that stands out in this game for me, so I'm not really looking to target any White Sox bats against Duffy. Let's see. We got Marco Estrada pitching for Toronto today. He has a low batting average this year. He's lowered the amount of home runs that he's given up. Over the course of the last 2 years, he was a high home run guy, giving up a lot of home runs, which I thought was going to be something really bad for him when pitching his home games in the Rogers Center. But he's actually been surprisingly good this year. I do think there are a couple Yankee bats you can look at if you're not a fan of Estrada. Mark Teixeira has a 420 WOBA with a 362 ISO score. So he's probably at tops on that list. He's probably the guy who has in the best shot for a home run. He had another one yesterday. He's been hitting them all the time. He's had a really, really nice comeback breakout season. Let's see. We got Brett Gardner with a 366 WOBA, 169 ISO score. You're not going to get a ton of power out of a guy like Gardner, but he does get some hits. He gets on base. He can steal. He can score from second on a cheap single. He can score from first on a double into the gap. So, his speed is definitely a weapon. It's something that has been helping him all year. His price is still pretty elevated, though, so you're really going to need a big game out of him in order to get him to pay off. And the last guy is Alex Rodriguez, 365 WOBA, 212 ISO number. Even in righty-on-righty matchups, he's been hitting pretty well this year. He's another guy who's had a really nice comeback season. So if you're going to go against Estrada, if you're not a believer in him, I think those three guys are the way to do it. Let's see here. We also have Miguel Gonzalez pitching against the Los Angeles Angels. He's allowed 18 home runs already this year. So you got to look at the two big right-handed bats. Even in a righty-on-righty matchup, Mike Trout, 427 WOBA, 314 ISO, so he's definitely in play. And the other guy has been kind of cold, and that's Albert Pujols. But against a pitcher who has a high home run rate, I think Pujols is somebody else you can look at. 375 WOBA, 274 ISO number. So those would be the two guys I'd look at that game. You got Justin Verlander pitching for Detroit, 270 batting average allowed to both sides of the plate. He's given up 5 home runs to each side of the plate. The only guy who I really like against Verlander today is going to be David Ortiz. Ortiz has been on fire. He's got 3 home runs in his last 4 games, 391 WOBA, 275 ISO in lefty-righty matchups. So this is another situation where I could see him having a good game. I don't know which Verlander is going to show up. We saw him 2 games back throw a gem and remind you of the Cy Young days that he had. And then he came back in his next start and gave up 3 or 4 runs. So, he's been pretty erratic all year. He hasn't been able to string together a couple good ones. So I don't really know what to expect out of him. But I do know that Ortiz has been very hot, that Verlander's been giving it up to left-handers, and Ortiz has been mashing righties. So you put all those things together, it should be a good spot to look at a guy like David Ortiz. Next guy we could talk about, Charlie Morton. Morton has a hit 288 against him. Only 4 home runs in 32 innings pitched, so not a ton of home runs he's allowing. But 288 is a pretty high average, especially going up against the Dodgers team that has a lot of left-handed bats. You got a guy like Yasmani Grandal on top, 393 WOBA, 247 ISO. Adrian Gonzalez, 392 WOBA, 258 ISO. And a guy who's been finding himself in the cleanup spot lately, who I think is going under the radar and is cheap on a bunch of sites. You can still get him pretty cheap over on Fantasy Feud. I know I threw him in my lineup over there this morning. 376 WOBA, 376 WOBA, 207 ISO for Andre Ethier. Again, he's cheap on a lot of sites, not just Feud. He's cheap on FanDuel today. He's cheap on DraftKings today. He's cheap on Fantasy Aces. So if you can, actually Aces, he's a little expensive. I think his price is getting up to like that $5,000 range. But on most of those other sites, you can get him for a pretty good discount. Like I said, I've been playing a lot over on Fantasy Feud lately, trying to get myself into that big $500,000 tournament they have at the end of the year. We have a lot of guys in our community who've been playing over there too. So if you guys have a chance, make sure you click through the Roto Curve links. We're offering a 100% deposit bonus up to $500 over there. Plus, we're giving you a free $25 from Roto Curve for you to play over on Fantasy Feud. Make sure you use the promo code CURVE when you sign up for it. They're the one company that still has qualifiers going on for their big end of the year championship. They're running a $500,000 championship with only 40 entries in it. It's one of the biggest ones that's being offered in the industry right now. I think it's actually the 3rd biggest behind the $1 million prize pools that DraftKings and FanDuel are offering. So it's definitely somewhere you should go take a look at. It's something you should try to get in on. Now let's see. Moving on from there, we have Henry Owens, who is the next guy we can consider. Henry Owens is a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. He's a left-handed rookie making his 2nd start. Got touched up a little bit at Yankee Stadium in his first start, mostly by some of the right-handed bats. Right-handed bats have been the way to go after him, even in the minor leagues, which is tough for this matchup for him, too, because you got a Detroit team that's littered with right-handed bats. I think this Detroit team might be a good one that you could stack up today. You got a guy like James McCann catching with a 437 WOBA, 271 ISO number. Jose Iglesias, who's been hitting in the 2-hole lately. He has a 401 WOBA with a 128 ISO against left-handers. You got Nick Castellanos, 392 WOBA, 145 ISO. Victor Martinez, 388 WOBA, 125 ISO. And JD Martinez, who's the guy with the power. He only has the 358 WOBA, but he does have a 220 ISO score. So he's the guy who should be getting you the extra base hits and driving in a couple runs. Moving on from there, we got Andrew Cashner going up today against the Phillies. Left-handed bats have been hitting 290 against him this season with 11 homers and 54 innings pitched. Again, against the Phillies team that's been absolutely red hot. So I think a guy like Cesar Hernandez, who had another big game yesterday at a really small price, is somebody you can look at. Again, left-handed batter. Cashner struggles with lefties. Cesar gets on. He's going to be stealing. Derek Norris played last night, so I'm not even sure who the backup catcher is for San Diego, but he's going to have a chance to go in there against the backup catcher most likely, and I could see Cesar getting a stolen base, runs scored, and paying off his salary in one at-bat like he's been doing lately. The other guy you could look at is Ryan Howard. WOBA's up to 352. His ISO is 247, which is huge. And, he's just been driving in runs lately. He's been hitting doubles. He's been hitting homers. He's been putting the ball in the gap. And the way that these guys in front of him have been getting on, as long as he's able to put the ball in play, he's going to wind up with some RBIs every game. And it seems like almost every game this guy's knocking in a couple runs right now. So you definitely have to look at him. You have to consider him, and you have to respect that fact because he's still pretty good value on just about every site across the industry. Next guy we can talk about is Jake Peavy. Peavy's allowed left-handed bats to hit only 254 against him, but he has given up 4 home runs in 19 innings. So you want to look at those 2 left-handed bats on Chicago. Kyle Schwarber, 487 WOBA, 317 ISO, one of the best catching options on the day, definitely in play. Anthony Rizzo, 384 WOBA, 253 ISO. I think both of these guys are in play. I think both of these guys are now getting a little bit expensive, and I think you really got to try to fit them in your roster. But Schwarber, especially here against Peavy, I think is an excellent option today. Next guy to talk about, Phil Hughes. Phil Hughes has allowed lefties to hit 271 with 13 home runs. He has allowed righties to hit 302 with 14 home runs. So this guy's been getting knocked around by both sides of the plate and giving up a lot of home runs, which makes this another good team that you might want to try to stack. The Cleveland Indians put up like 12 or 13 runs last night. They had a really, really good game. And there's a couple guys here I think you should consider. Michael Brantley, number 1, top of the list, 376 WOBA, 165 ISO number. I think he's probably the guy who I'm going to try to get into the most of my rosters. A sneaky first base option or a catcher option if he's still catcher eligible on the site you're playing, or third base option if you need to fit him over there on some sites, is Carlos Santana. 346 WOBA, but a big 223 ISO score. He does have home run power, and in this matchup against Hughes, who's basically allowed a lot of home runs and a pretty high average to both sides of the plate, I think Santana is somebody who's very safe for you to roll out there, and I'm definitely going to have a couple shares of him in some of my lineups. I also think you can stack up this Cleveland team. I don't think a lot of people are going to do it with Kipnis being hurt and a couple, guys getting shuffled around in the lineup. It's a lot cheaper to stack them up right now, so you're still going to be able to fit some of the big pitching in, or to go after, a big bat or two as well to put with them. But I definitely think that this could be that sneaky stack that wins somebody a lot of money, because Phil Hughes does have the ability to give up 2 or 3 home runs. And if you get 2 or 3 home runs along with a couple hits and a couple runs scored from everybody that you have in that stack, it's going to put up a pretty big score for you, and you're going to be able to, hopefully take down some tournaments with them today. Next guy I want to look at, Pat Corbin from Arizona. He's a left-handed pitcher. Has allowed righties to only hit 247 against him with 5 homers in 24 innings. So the numbers don't jump off the page, but this is actually some of the best pitching we've seen out of Corbin. So there is a chance that he could regress to his normal mean. Guys like Todd Frazier, who has been absolutely ice cold lately, stands out. 408 WOBA, 398 ISO. But again, this guy has had good matchups all week against left-handed pitching, and he hasn't hit a lick. With that being said, I'm going to tell you not to play him today, and he's going to go out and hit 2 home runs. He stands out based on the numbers, but just look at his recent game logs before you get a little too crazy, because there's a lot of offers in there and, a lot of strikeouts, and he just hasn't looked right at the plate. Joey Votto, 403 WOBA, 160 ISO, lefty-on-lefty matchup, but he's still pretty good even in a lefty-on-lefty situation. And you also have a guy like Marlon Byrd, who actually has been doing okay lately. 384 WOBA for Bird, 246 ISO. So those are some really good numbers. He always tends to fly under the radar. And as I said, right now he's actually hitting a little bit better than Frazier. Frazier seems to, really be in a slump since the All-Star break. We got Anthony DeSclafani on the other side of that. Left-handed bats are hitting 254 against him with 9 home runs and 64 innings pitched. David Peralta, probably the best guy to stand out based on that lefty thing. 372 WOBA for him, 233 ISO. He's been batting cleanup lately. He's been a pretty good hitter. You got guys like Castillo and Goldie from the right side. Both have over 400 WOBAs. Both of them have ISOs over 200. I think, might even be over 300 at this point for Castillo. Even though it's a righty-on-righty matchup, I mean, DeSclafani's been kind of tough on right-handers, but both of these guys are very, very good hitters. So I think you can put both of them in play and consider both of them as well, with WOBAs over 400 against righties. Let's see, we got Bartolo Colon. Left-handed bats are hitting 314 against him with 8 homers in 60 innings. He's also given up 9 homers to right-handed bats, but they have a much lower average. So I think we'd rather look at the left-handers in this one. Really, the only guy that stands out, if he's in there, is John Jaso. 369 WOBA, 167 ISO number. He had been leading off for Tampa Bay a little bit lately. Again, he's the only guy that I would really consider from the left side on that team. And I don't think I'd use any of these right-handed bats against Colon, even though he hasn't been all that great lately. Let's see, we got Jared Weaver going up against Baltimore. He's allowed a 272 average and about 8 home runs to each side of the plate. So whether it's righties or lefties, you don't have to worry about it. Also the kind of guy that you wouldn't mind stacking against. So if you wanted to throw a Baltimore stack in there to be, different from the field, I don't think that's a horrible idea today either. But the 2 guys who really stand out to me, I love Manny Machado in this matchup. 386 WOBA, 235 ISO. Weaver's always been a guy who hasn't been great against right-handed pitching, at least in the last couple of years. So I think Machado, who hit a home run last night, is in a good spot today to do some more damage. I also think you can look at a guy like Chris Davis, 359 WOBA, 287 ISO. He's another one that I think you can consider and put into your order. Those would be the 2 big bats on Baltimore that I would look to use if I was going to be using anybody. The next game is another one I think you can stack up pretty good, and that is the Alex Wood game going up against Pittsburgh. Wood is now on the Dodgers. He's allowed a 297 batting average this year to right-handed bats with 8 homers and 92 innings. A lot of these guys on Pittsburgh profile very well against left-handed pitching. You got Francisco Cervelli, who has a 449 WOBA with a 196 ISO. If he's in there as a catcher, he's definitely a good salary-saving option to look at. Andrew McCutchen, 389 WOBA, 149 ISO, so he's somebody else in play. Sterling Marte, 387 WOBA with a 250 ISO. So he's the guy that's probably the best bet to hit a home run. Excuse me. Most spots he's cheaper than McCutchen. So if you find him cheaper than McCutchen, I think that if you had to choose between the 2, I'd probably go with Marte today. And the last guy is Jung-Ho Kang, the shortstop. He's been batting cleanup for them lately. He's got a 380 WOBA and a 211 ISO. So you're not going to find that kind of power or a matchup this good out of a lot of shortstops. And again, he's a little bit of a discount on some of the sites depending on where you're playing. So I think he's another guy you can look at. Let's see. We got Colby Lewis going up today against Seattle. Lewis has allowed left-handed bats to hit 278 with 10 homers. And right-handed bats have a lower average, but they've hit 9 homers against them as well. So you got to look for the home run hitters in this matchup. That leads me to the one guy who really stands out on the numbers, and that's Nelson Cruz. 395 WOBA, 252 ISO. So I think if anybody that I'm going to use on Seattle, he's probably the one bat that I think is truly in play. Let's see. We got Mikey Fires, who was just traded. He is on Houston now, if I'm not mistaken. So he's going up against Oakland today. He has very high K rate, but he also has a pretty high home run rate over his career, especially the left-handed bats. This Oakland offense has not been hitting well, but I think you got to look at a guy like Reddick, 373 WOBA with a 194 ISO number. And the guy who has the most home run power, even though he hasn't been hitting well either, is Stephen Vogt, 362 WOBA with a 224 ISO. Again, this game's in Oakland. I'm not looking for a ton of offense, but those would be the 2 guys that I would put in my rosters if I was going to use anybody from this Oakland offense. Let's see. Next guy we got up on the mound is Jimmy Nelson versus St. Louis. Left-handed bats are hitting 290 against him with 7 homers and 54 innings pitched. The one guy who truly stands out based on the numbers, based on recency, based on everything is Matt Carpenter. Carpenter has raised his WOBA up to 380, his ISO up to 212 against right-handed pitching. He has 6 home runs in his last 9 games. The guy is just absolutely unbelievable. You guys know he's one of my favorite players. He's a cash game staple every day. But if he's going to have 6 homers in 9 games and he's going to start doing that, He's gonna start being a staple in tournament plays every day as well. Like I said, I use this guy in cash. He always racks up a couple hits for you. He's hitting on top of the order again, so he's back in the spot where he's going to score a lot of runs. He can steal a base for you if he needs to. He can get a couple singles for you. He'll walk. He'll get a couple doubles, and apparently he even has home run power now. So there's really no drawbacks to using him. His price is starting to come up on every single site. His price has crept up over the last week or two with the way he's been playing. So really, if you're going to give a knock to him, that's about the only knock I can put on the guy. Let's see. We have Jose Quintana. Right-handed bats are hitting 298 against him with 9 home runs. He is pitching in Kauffman Stadium, which is a pretty good pitcher's park. The only guy I'd really look at on that Royals team is Lorenzo Cain. Cain hasn't been great lately, but he does still have a 439 WOBA and a 248 ISO number against left-handed pitching. And again, Quintana has been absolutely lights out to lefties. Righties have been the only ones who've been able to do anything against them. So that's pretty much the way you want to go if you're going to go any way there. Last guy to talk about, Shelby Miller. Left-handed bats are hitting 263 against him with 6 homers in 66 innings, so that's not too bad. And the only guy who really stands out, the Marlins are going to throw a lot of left-handed bats at him, so it could be a tough game for Miller. The one guy who stands out for them, though, is Derek Dietrich. If Dietrich's back in the 2-hole, he's got a 376 WOBA with a 253 ISO number. He would be the only guy that I would really want to have in my lineup. But I don't think I would use Shelby Miller today because I do think that it's going to be a tough game for him with all those lefties that the Marlins can throw at him. Just to round everything out, Lackey's going up against Milwaukee. Not really looking to target any bats in that one. Tanaka against Toronto. That's a tough game for me. I like the way Tanaka's been pitching, but Toronto is one of the best offenses in the league. I just don't have any certainty that I would use in cash games, but, any of those Toronto bats or Tanaka could be guys that you use in the tournament, depending on which side of that fence you're sitting on. But again, it could go either way, so there's no certainty in cash games for me, so I'm going to be staying away in there. Let's see. We got Felix against Texas. Again, which Felix shows up, which Texas team shows up. Texas has a lot of lefty bats. Felix, when he's on, it doesn't matter if you're lefty or righty. So I don't know how that's going to go. I'm not targeting much there. Kluber, I really like today. He's one of my favorite pitchers going up against Minnesota, so I don't want any Twins bats. You got Arrieta against San Francisco. I like Arrieta. I also like San Francisco's offense, so I'm not really sure which side of the fence I want to be on, but not targeting too many bats in that one. Archer's going up against the Mets. This could be a pretty good spot for Archer. I think he has a good chance to pick up the win here, especially going against Bartolo Colon, so I don't want any Mets bats. And Scherzer going up against Colorado. Colorado's actually been pretty good lately, but it's Max Scherzer, so I don't want any Colorado bats either. So that pretty much sums it up for our Benny's Bat section for today. Thank you guys for joining us here on this Sunday morning. And as always, stay classy, DFS.